My name is David Fishman. I'm professor of history at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and my topic is The Book Smugglers of the Vilna Ghetto, a story of spiritual resistance. A remarkable story which was known in its general contours for decades, but one that through a lot of archival research I was able to flesh out into a full-fledged book, which is about the rescue of tens of thousands of Jewish books, documents, manuscripts, works of art, and all kinds of Jewish cultural treasures from the Nazis by ghetto inmates during the Holocaust. This story of moral resistance, spiritual resistance, takes place in Vilna. Vilna was, on the eve of the war, the fourth largest Jewish community in Poland. After Warsaw, Lodz, and Lvov, Vilna was fourth. It was not numerically a great community. On the eve of the German invasion, which was in 1941, there were 70,000 Jews in Vilna, but they did make up a third of the population of the city, so proportionately a very Jewish city. But more important than numbers is the special intellectual tradition of the Vilna Jewish community, which really began with the Vilna Gaon, Rabbeinu Eliyahu, Elijah of Vilna, from the late 18th century, who stressed the centrality of study above all else in Judaism, even more than prayer, even more than acts of goodness. It was study of the holy books that he considered the central activity. And he is the father of a kind of intellectualist, bookish tradition of Vilna Jewry. And it's thanks to him that Vilna became a great center of Hebrew printing. The Vilna Shas, the classical edition of the Talmud, was printed in Vilna. In the 20th century, when most Jews become more secular and more modern, Vilna shifts to becoming a great center of modern Yiddish printing, of Yiddish press and Yiddish books. At its peak, there were 5 daily Yiddish newspapers in this relatively middle-sized Jewish community. Vilna is the city of the book. In other words, what I'm setting up for you is to understand why this is such an important story, because it concentrated, this city, this community, concentrated within it so many Jewish cultural treasures, which were at risk under the Nazis. Vilna had a great Jewish community library known as the Strashun Library, which was located right next to the great synagogue, the Stotshul. This library had probably the greatest library under Jewish auspices in Europe prior to the Holocaust. It had 5 Hebrew incunabula, that is, books printed before 1500 in Hebrew. It had hundreds of imprints from the 1500s, many rarities, and it also served as a kind of communal cultural center. It was open 7 days a week, including Shabbos, except on Shabbos you couldn't take notes, you couldn't order books, but if you'd ordered a book beforehand, you could walk into the library and read. And that was an important symbolic statement by the Strashun Library, that reading is integral to life, and therefore there's no day off from it. Another great collection in Vilna was that of the Yiddish Scientific Institute of YIVO. Here I'd like to stress more than the library, though it did have an important Yiddish library. More important, I think, is to stress the importance of the YIVO archives, which included the records of all kinds of Jewish communal organizations, documents such as ephemera, that is, things that people usually throw out, like handbills, posters, things of that kind, folklore, collected mainly by volunteer collectors, as they were known, Sammlers at that time. And this city, besides the two great collections of the library, the Strashun Library, and the Ivo Archive, had many other collections. There was a Jewish museum in Vilna. There were Hebrew and Yiddish teachers' seminaries. There was a prominent yeshiva, synagogues, and there were many individuals who had great personal libraries, whether they were rabbis or whether they were writers or scholars. This was, true to be told, a great center of Jewish book culture. Finally, Vilna was not just absorbing or passively consuming book fare, it was producing it. And there were writers, especially in the interwar period between World War I and World War II, the very well-known group Jung Vilna, of poets, prose writers, and even plastic artists. It belonged to this group. And in the photograph I'm showing here, you'll see, especially in the front row, second from right and third from right, the poets Avram Sutzkever and Shmerke Kaczerginsk. Sutzkever, later to become what most consider the greatest Yiddish poet of the 20th century. He was the grandson of a rabbi. He was apolitical, that he didn't belong, his ideology, as he said, was poetry. And next to him, Shmerke Kaczerginsk, who was an orphan, who grew up without parents and lived in an orphanage, was a worker in a print shop. In other words, you would never have expected such a person to grow up to become a poet. He did. He was also a political activist, and he was active in the underground Communist Party of pre-war Poland. And they are best friends, and even though they are in many ways polar opposites in Jung Vilna. Now I'm turning to the heart of my talk and the topic itself, something about the German occupation. The Germans came to Vilna late, between 39 and 41. Most of the time, Vilna was under Soviet rule or Soviet domination. The Germans come with the attack on the Soviet Union on June 21st, 1941. So they come late, but they, as far as the murder machine against the Jews, they act very quickly and efficiently. The Vilna Ghetto was formed in September 1941. Initially, there were two ghettos, but the ghetto number 2, on this image, the one higher up, ghetto number 2 only lasted 6 weeks, whereas ghetto number 1, the larger ghetto, lasted 2 years. Most importantly, in the first 6 months of the German occupation, more than 2/3 of the Jews of Vilna were murdered. That is, on the eve of the German occupation, there were 70,000 Jews. By January 1942, there were only 20,000 Jews left in Vilna. The 50,000 that were murdered were not sent to Auschwitz or some other kind of death camp. There were no death camps at that point in the second half of 1941. They were murdered in what we now call the Holocaust by bullets. That is, they were taken to the outskirts. They were rounded up, grabbed, taken to the outskirts of the city, and mowed down by machine gun into pits at a place known, now infamous, in Yiddish as Ponar, in Polish Ponari, in Lithuanian Panirai. And then, quite extraordinarily, in January 1942, the systematic murder of Jews in Vilna stopped. There will be all kinds of atrocities between January 1942 and the eventual liquidation of the Vilna Ghetto in September 1943, but nothing on the scale or scope of those first 6 months. Instead, for most ghetto inmates, life is a frightening and grim and difficult routine. Jews are organized as slave laborers in different work brigades. Most of those brigades leave the ghetto in the morning through the ghetto gate, and they will return to the ghetto at the end of the workday. Because official food rations are very meager, most inmates want to smuggle food into the ghetto. Whether they succeed or not depends on many factors, but if they are caught, they can be sent to their death just for a little bit of food under their clothing. There was an opera singer, a popular singer in the Vilna Ghetto, Luba Levitskaya. She hid a bag of peas on her body, and when that bag of peas was found, she was sent to her death. And the inmates are hoping against hope that eventually the Red Army will come and liberate them from this terrible experience. And now to the core of my story. That is the setting. This period from January 1942 till August, September 1943 is known as the period of stability in the history of the Vilna Ghetto, compared to the first 6 months, which were the period of great trauma and bloodletting. My story is mainly a story from the period of stability. Now I need to introduce you to this organization, the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, which we'll call for short the ERR. The ERR, the Rosenberg Stab, was Nazi Germany's premier agency for the looting of cultural treasures. The Nazis believe it, the Aryans, as the master race, should have the master library, the master museum, the master archive. All cultural treasures should belong to the Aryans, to the master race. And therefore they looted cultural treasures all across Europe. Of course, very actively in places like Paris and Amsterdam, where they stole art, but actually everywhere, where they stole books, and where they stole manuscripts, and where they stole all kinds of historical documents. What is less known is that this organization, the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, had a department for looting Judaica, for looting, stealing, seizing books that related to the history and culture of the Jews. Books in Hebrew, books in Yiddish, books in all languages that dealt with this subject matter. It's a paradox that on the one hand the Germans were massively murdering Jews, and on the other hand we could say they were collecting Judaica books. But actually, when one looks at it a little closely, it's not a paradox. The Nazis wanted to have Judaica books for the budding academic, quote-unquote, field of Judenforschung, the study of the Jews. The Nazis believed that their anti-Semitism was not just an emotional thing or a bias or prejudice, but that their anti-Semitism was predicated on science, on scientific reality and investigation. And therefore they wanted scholarship or science to show scientifically, quote unquote, how vile the Jews were, how dangerous the Jews were, why they must be persecuted and eventually murdered. But to do that, to have Judenforschung, you must have the raw material, you must have the primary sources, you must have the books, the manuscripts, the documents. And that's why there was a Judaica department in the ERR. The head of that department was this man, Dr. Johannes Paul. Paul has an extraordinary biography. He was an ordained Catholic priest. He studied advanced religious studies first in Rome and then in Jerusalem. and in Jerusalem acquired advanced command of Hebrew, both biblical Hebrew and even modern Hebrews. There are some reports that he even attended some classes at the Hebrew University. He picked up Yiddish. Then he dropped all of that, stopped being a priest, and returned to Germany, where he became a committed, devoted Nazi and a Nazi bibliographer and book thief, book looter. And Paul knew how important and central Vilna was as a Jewish community as far as Jewish book lore and historical documentation was concerned. Paul came to Vilna literally 10 to 12 days after the Wehrmacht, after the German army invaded and seized the city. He's there right on the heels of the military to get a lay of the land. You know, where are the major collections? What do they have? With the idea, of course, of sending the material to Germany for the purposes of Judenforschung. He was, of course, stunned. He was stunned because he never imagined there were so many Jewish books in so many libraries, so many documents, so many repositories, and he really is overwhelmed because he can't send everything to Germany, and there's no need to send 10 copies of the same book to Germany. There must be some kind of sorting process to decide what will be sent to Germany for Judenforschung. To Germany means mainly to this institute with which he was affiliated, the Institut zur Erforschung der Judenfrage, the Institute for the Study of the Jewish Question. So there must be a sorting process. What will go there to that institute and what will be disposed of as trash? But who's going to do that sorting process? There are not a lot of Johannes Pauls out there with command of Hebrew and Yiddish, with specialists, and so therefore he creates a slave labor brigade of Jewish ghetto inmates who will be forced to do this sorting. What goes to Germany? What goes to trash? What will be destroyed? And Paul creates a quota. No more than 20% can be sent to Germany. 80% will be disposed of as trash. As the head of this slave labor brigade, which gets the nickname the Paper Brigade because they work with paper, the head is Hermann Crook, who had been a librarian in Warsaw, the head of one of the greatest Jewish libraries in Warsaw before the war, and who had fled to Vilna. Crook is a socialist, a Bundist, who really believed that books and education were the key to raising up the working class. He is, not that he wanted to, but he is appointed by the Germans to head this brigade. His deputy is Zelig Kalmanovich, a scholar from the Yiddish Scientific Institute, YIVO, who had actually 2 doctorates, one from a German university, one from a Russian university. A polymath, somebody who knew just about everything. There was a quip that somebody once said, when Zelig Kalmanovich walks into the room, I don't need an encyclopedia. He is, at this point, when the Germans enter, a religious man, a believer, keeping Torah and mitzvahs. He's also a Zionist. His son lives in Eretz Yisrael. But these 2 men who are really heading the brigade, the socialist Bundist and the religious Zionist, work actually together in this enterprise and work quite well. And they had a brigade that at its peak had a staff of 40 people, 20 intellectual workers who actually did the sorting, and 20 technical workers who are really just taking care of the building, packing boxes and crates, shipping things, etc. Among those intellectual workers are our 2 poets that we talked about earlier from Jung Vilna, Avram Sutzkever and Shmerke Kaczerginsk. And also with them is a remarkable woman, Rachel Pupko-Krinsky. She was a high school teacher of history. She had a master's degree in history from Vilna University. She knew Latin and Old Polish. She has a special personal story because when she entered the Vilna Ghetto in September 1941, she entered alone. Her husband had been killed in the first roundups in the summer of 41. Their little daughter, less than 2 years old, she decided not to take the daughter into the ghetto. She handed the daughter over to her Polish nanny, said goodbye to her daughter, and her daughter would be raised for the duration of the war as a Catholic by the nanny. And their work of these intellectual workers is excruciating for them because they're all book lovers, they're all readers, they're all people who appreciate art and history, and they're being forced to be complicit, to collaborate in the destruction of Jewish cultural, the looting and destruction of Jewish cultural heritage. And their day is one of sorting, of making piles. This to Germany, this to the trash heap. And they can't live with themselves because this is a very painful experience for them to see tractors or bulldozers come and just take away these books and documents. Perhaps the most painful thing is to see the treatment of Torah scrolls, of Sifrei Torah. Torah scrolls were not sent to Germany by and large and were not disposed of as trash. Torah scrolls, because they're made of parchment, because they're made effectively of leather, were used as inserts to repair German army boots. And perhaps that captures the sense, the burning sense of anger and the need to do something to not be part of that. And the main way they rescued these books and papers, there were many ways, but the single most significant way was by, like everybody else who hid food under their clothing, was to hide books and papers under their clothing, in their shoes and boots, under their socks, under their trousers, under their shirt, at the end of the workday, and then to go to the ghetto gate and pass through an inspection. And of course, if they'd been caught, there was always the risk that they would be sent to their deaths for that. Several times people were caught. They were fortunate enough that they were just beaten very badly. No one was directly sent to their death for smuggling the books and papers. A lot depended on who was guarding the ghetto gate at the moment when they arrived. If there were Jewish ghetto police, that usually would not be a severe consequence. Even if there were Lithuanian police, that wouldn't be as severe. But if there were Germans manning the gate, then all bets were off. And there were many lucky, just simply moments of luck when the group was able to get material in. They went back, they took the material back into the ghetto because the ghetto was Jewish territory. They felt that it's close to them, it's accessible to them, it's safe, they can always check on it. So they really wanted the material to go from the work site, which was outside the ghetto, into the ghetto where they would hide it in different bunkers and hiding places. This was done for a year and a half. In other words, the brigade started working in February 1942. It continued and worked until August of 1943. And you can do the simple math. Let's say there are 500 working days, and there were 20 people smuggling material, and each smuggled, let's say, 3 items a day. So 3 times 20 times 500 is 30,000. They were able, through this mechanism, and there were many others, to rescue 30,000 items. Inside the ghetto, there were all kinds of hiding places, the most prominent being a bunker under the ground. You entered through a manhole in the sewage system, and Then there were ladders, and then a bunker with crates. This bunker was built initially actually for the FPO, for the partisan organization of the Vilna Ghetto, the armed resistance that was planning a great Vilna Ghetto uprising. But the FPO, the partisans, offered the paper brigade to keep in that same bunker the rare books and treasures that they had smuggled in. So you had in this bunker side-by-side crates of guns and crates of books, sort of representing these very two types of resistance, the armed resistance and the moral or spiritual resistance in the ghetto. Here it's important to pause and talk about why they did this. And maybe that is the most important. Other people were smuggling in food, and they were smuggling in books. I think the reasons are many, but I'll mention two or three. Most important of all, I just think this was an existential statement. They wanted what was left of their life, and probably their death, to be connected with something they considered important. And they wanted, therefore, to connect the rest of their life, which they thought was very short, with books, with Jewish heritage and culture. And if they were going to die, they wanted to die because they tried to rescue a rare Jewish book, not because they tried to smuggle a potato. Second of all was a statement about faith in the future of the Jewish people, that there would be a Jewish people after all of this, and that was not clear if you were then in the Vilna Ghetto, but they believed there would be a Jewish people, and it would need these cultural treasures in order to rebuild Jewish life. So they did it for future generations as a kind of a very selfless act, not for themselves, but for the Jewish people. And finally, they were all proud Vilners, members of the Jewish community of Vilna, and I think they felt that by rescuing the books, they were rescuing the essence and core of what Jewish Vilna was about. The Jews could not be rescued, but the amazing collections, the amazing treasures that they had amassed could be rescued, and that would be a kind of testament to Vilna. There were other ways things were, materials were rescued. I only mentioned briefly one other, which was with non-Jewish friends. Here it's important to explain that the work site where this paper brigade worked was not guarded during the lunch hour. The Germans left, and the Jewish slave laborers were left to their own devices in the building, which was the former evil building. No one was going to escape for many reasons. If one person escaped, they'd all be punished. If they all escaped, their families would be murdered. It's interwar Poland. It's not obvious that anybody will help you if you try to escape. So they stay there during the lunch hour. But that's an opportunity for their non-Jewish friends to come visit them at the work site and take material out with them, as long as they left before the Germans returned. So one such person is Ona Shemaitya, an ethnic Lithuanian, a professional librarian at the Vilna University Library. She knew many of these people. They'd been her customers, her clients at the university library before the Germans came. And she rescued a great deal of material and put it in her home and various other places. Ona Shemaitya even rescued at one point a Jewish girl from the ghetto, hid it in her home, and Ona Shemaitya is one of the first people that Yad Vashem recognized as a righteous Gentile, as Hasidat Umot HaOlam. Now, to move the story forward. Our two poets survive the ghetto. They got out before the ghetto was liquidated. They left the ghetto for the forests in early September 1943, just 2 weeks before the ghetto was liquidated. And they will both spend a good deal of time in the forests with Soviet-led partisan brigades. The heads of this paper brigade, the librarian Crook, the scholar Kalmanovich, perish. They're sent to labor camps in Estonia where they die of disease or are shot. The vast majority of members of the Paper Brigade perished. Over, my estimate is 7 or 8 survived. Between 30 and 33 perished. But those, and Rochel Krinsky, the high school teacher of history, barely survived. She was sent to a camp called Stotov near Danzig. The Stotov Camp was an overflow camp for Auschwitz. It was originally a labor camp, but in 1944 it's converted into a death camp. And Rochel Krinsky, it had a crematorium, it had a whole apparatus for disposing of bodies. Rochel Krinsky expected that, as she saw the smoke come out of the crematorium, that she would be next. She was just very fortunate that the Red Army came before her turn came up. She survives, but she survives very much as a broken woman. She writes letters shortly after she's liberated to the poets in Vilna, where she says, I really can't find any meaning to this life. I see other people getting married, falling in love, but I can't even imagine that for myself. I don't know what love means anymore. She has only one healthy instinct, and that is to reunite with her daughter. And as she writes in those letters, not that I can do anything for my daughter in my current state. I hear Vanani's been a wonderful mother, but maybe my daughter can do something for me. Maybe I can find some kind of meaning in this life, some kind of purpose, if I reunite with my daughter. And she will eventually do that, I will explain a bit later. The Soviets liberated Vilna on July 13th, 1944. Together with them, and shortly after with them, members of the Paper Brigade converge on the city. They return to a Vilna in ruins. The synagogue, such as the Vilna Gaon's Klois, the Vilna Gaon's synagogue is in ruins. The Yivo building is bombed out and in ruins. They return not because they're looking for family or friends, because they know their family and friends are already murdered. They return not because they want to get property, an apartment or a house or anything. They return to finish the job, to dig up the cultural treasures that they had hidden during the ghetto years. And they know very well that the leaders of their work brigade, Crook and Kalmanovich, have been murdered, and they're doing it also for their murdered colleagues. And there's a retrieval operation that begins, led by the two poets, Sutzkever and Kaczerginsk, but which was really participated in by just about all returning survivors to Vilna in the summer and fall of 1944, taking hand wagons, discovering fragments of Torah scrolls. And Abba Kovner, who had been the leader of a second leader of the FPO, of the partisan movement in the ghetto, now returns to Vilna, and he participates actively in this retrieval operation and helps the others to found a Jewish museum in Vilna. This Jewish museum in Vilna was founded on July 26th, 1944. That is 13 days after the liberation of Vilna, by these three men. And the only building, they needed a building because they're finding so much from so many directions. The only building they could access was actually a building in the former Vilna Ghetto. It had been the building of the ghetto library, and in front of it was a cleared away space, which was the ghetto sports field. And next to it was also the ghetto prison. So this complex, which was a central address in the Vilna Ghetto, becomes their workspace. It brings up terribly painful memories, but they really have no choice. There is no other space. And that museum functions. Again, they've got to unpack, they've got to catalog, but they quickly come to realize something they hadn't thought about, which is this Jewish museum in Vilna which they hope will be a kind of memorial and monument to their community, and also as a kind of research center. They have many dreams for that Jewish museum. What they didn't realize was this Jewish museum was in the Soviet Union. Vilnius was now the capital of the Lithuanian Soviet Socialist Republic, and while the Soviets were by no means engaged in genocide against the Jews, they were, especially in this point after World War II, becoming increasingly antithetical and hostile to Jewish culture, to expressions of Jewish culture. The head of the Soviet regime right then and there, in those years, 45, 46, was Mikhail Suslov, the head of the Lithuanian Bureau of the Communist Party. And Suslov is dead set against the existence of a Jewish museum in Vilna. And therefore, the government apparatus is totally uncooperative. They can't get glass to repair their windows. They can't get a salary. They can't get even pencils and pens. And the worst thing that happens is one night they had a lot of material in the courtyard, not in the building, but outside in the courtyard. Garbage trucks came and took away the material in the courtyard away as trash. And that's when Sutzkever, the last straw for Sutzkever, and especially for Kaczerginsk, who had been a communist, where they realized the material is in danger again. If it stays in the Soviet Union, it could be destroyed, or it will, at the very best, be sent away somewhere where no one will have access to it. And that begins their second rescue operation, which is to get the material out of the Soviet Union. As former Polish citizens, Jews from Vilna were former Polish citizens since before the war Vilna was Poland, they had the right to emigrate, or as they called it, repatriate to Poland. So Sutzkever, Kaczerginsk, others take out a lot of material in suitcases with false bottoms and through other devices out of Soviet Lithuania to Poland. The Brigade, the Zionist movement to illegally move Jews to the land of Israel, is also engaged in this. And they were able to take a lot of material, not everything, of course, not most of what was in the Jewish Museum, but a good portion of it out to Poland. But Poland is not very hospitable to Jews either in those years, the famous pogrom in Kielce in July 1946. So the poets move on and have to move the material on with them from Poland to France, to Paris. But in Poland, something important happens. Rachela Kryński gets to Poland from her camp in Stotov, and she asks her nanny, her Polish nanny, to bring the daughter to her in Poland, where they re-meet after 4 years of not seeing each other. This almost 2-year-old is now 6 years old. She doesn't recognize this woman as her mother. She considers the nanny her mother, and there's months of a rather tense triangle and a very difficult relationship between the mother, the nanny, and this little girl, Sarah, who had been going as Irena for the entire duration of the war. But after many months, Rachel is able to write in letters, "I've done it. I am her mother again." The poets will eventually leave in different directions. Sutzkever will eventually end up in Eretz Yisrael, even before it was the state of Israel. Kaczerginsk will linger longer in Paris, eventually end up in Buenos Aires. But the most of the material they will send to New York, to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, the reconstituted YIVO, in New York City. They will send it through many different ways. The Jewish Museum in Vilna was closed down by the Soviet authorities in 1949. All of its materials were sent to Lithuanian repositories and actually hidden in Lithuanian repositories, put in the basement, covered, and were really utterly inaccessible. Most of them were material, the books were in St. George's Church in Vilnius, a former church, which was then the book chamber of the Lithuanian Soviet Socialist Republic, and it really lay there largely untouched, unknown, unresearched, inaccessible for 40 years, from 1949 1949 till 1989. Now, I've been talking a lot about books and papers and rescue of materials. I just want to conclude by pointing out some examples of the kinds of materials they rescued. A diary by Theodore Herzl, written in the 1880s before Herzl became the father of the modern Zionist movement. A record book, the record book of the Pinkas of the Klois of the Vilna Gaon, the record book of the Synagogue of the Vilna Gaon. This record book spans more than 150 years. It begins in the 1750s and it goes through the 1920s. So the synagogue was destroyed, but its minute book, which records all decisions by its board, financial and elections and seats and things like that, has been preserved. All kinds of little Yiddish booklets that were easy to hide under one's clothing, such as the one on the right here, Prayers for Childbirth. Prayers that women can recite, tchenis in Yiddish, that women can recite while giving birth. Letters by Sholem Aleichem, more than 50 letters. Sholem Aleichem, the great Yiddish writer, author of Tevye the Dairyman, which became the basis for Fiddler on the Roof. Of course, the poets especially had a soft spot in their heart for writings by authors, and therefore they spent a lot of effort rescuing these letters by Sholem Aleichem. A bust of Leon Tolstoy, the great Russian writer, by a Jewish sculptor from Vilna, Ilya Ginsburg. And they did also rescue material from their own time, from the ghetto. That wasn't their primary focus, but they did collect and preserve and hide and then retrieve ghetto documentation, such as this concert program of the Symphony Orchestra of the Vilna Ghetto. And this call to armed resistance by the FPO. Jeden geht nicht wie Schaf zu der Schritte. Jews do not go like sheep to the slaughter. As I mentioned, Sutzkever settled in Israel, had a long and illustrious career there as a writer, as an editor. Among his readers were such leaders of Israel, such as Golda Meir and the third president of Israel, Zalman Shazar. Kaczerginsk settled in Buenos Aires, headed a Jewish culture organization there, and when he took that job said, I know what devotion to Jewish culture is. Me and my colleagues in the paper Brigade demonstrated devotion to Jewish culture, and I will demonstrate that same devotion here in Buenos Aires. Rochel Popkokrinsky settled in New York. She had a brother here, she had family here, and here in New York she met a fellow survivor of the Vilna Ghetto that she married. She did remarry, something she never imagined would happen when she was liberated. She raised her daughter. She lived to see her granddaughter, Alex Wall, who lives in Berkeley, California today. So this is a story of people who were willing to risk their lives for books. It was not just a line, it was a real decision. And in that sense, they're heroes. I think a hero, by definition, is someone who risks their life for a noble cause bigger than themselves. These people were not concerned about rescuing themselves or, survival. That was the last thing on their mind. So they were willing to sacrifice their survival in order to do something bigger, which was to rescue these Jewish cultural heritage. And therefore it is a great story and a very Vilna story, right? The importance of books, the importance of the mind and of culture. And therefore it's a great example of Jewish efforts to live in dignity, and if necessary, die in dignity in the years of the Holocaust.